Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. At the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, e-commerce sales spiked abruptly, and this is something that had a tendency to frustrate and did frustrate our already troubled supply chain infrastructure and workforce. Now, some of the challenges included truck driver shortages. Others involved outdated scheduling technology or port concentration, lack of storage capacity for containers, port labor difficulties and shortages, and scarce freight equipment, including things like truck chassis. I want to make very clear these are not just coastal state issues. Utah, not a coastal state, it's entirely landlocked. And yet Utahns and Utah businesses are very directly feeling the effects of our supply chain backlog. And they're experiencing everything from empty store shelves, online orders taking weeks for delivery for things that used to take days, and price hikes basically across the board. Sometimes more excessive with some goods than others, but they're being felt everywhere. Utahns and Americans generally are, of course, looking for solutions right now. And while we certainly will have to address some of the long-term root causes of these problems, it's not something that should distract us from the fact that there are also temporary but immediate actions that I think we can and must take in order to ease the backlogs, especially in time for the holidays. I've packaged some of these shorter-term actions into a single bill, a bill that I refer to as the Stop the Grinch Act. Mr. Butler, I'd like to just start with you on this, because in your testimony you mentioned the lack of container storage as an issue, and that U.S. landside capacity simply can't keep up with the volume of import cargo. Now, it seems to me like we need both short and long-term capacity. In the long term, I think there are a lot of options that are attractive, including things like the Utah Inland Port, which can store containers and ease the burden. But that takes a while, of course. So in the shorter term, would temporarily using some land managed by the Bureau of Land Management for multiple uses to store overflow containers, is that something that could help alleviate the challenges with landside capacity?
Senator, there's no question that among the tools everyone's looking at is temporary inland storage. With respect to any particular piece of property, there's a whole laundry list of things you have to go through to know if it's going to work. Is it in the right place? Can you secure it, et cetera?
Sure.
But
I'm just referring to extra space generally. I assume that would be helpful if we could free up extra space.
That would be helpful, yes.
Now, you also mentioned the availability of truck chassis. So not only are containers sitting on chassis, rendering them useless for additional transportation needs until the container can be delivered, but the emergence of more e-commerce has also highlighted the need for more truck chassis as well. Do you think increasing the amount of available chassis would help alleviate the backlog? If we could do that, overall, increase the number of chassis, would that be beneficial?
Overall, it would probably help, but when I talk to people in the terminals and at the ports, frankly, what I hear most often is we need to use what we have better. We need to keep things moving.
Right. And to that end, to the end of using what we have better, what about expediting the processing of TWIC credentials? Would that help some of the workforce challenges at the port?
I have not heard of that being a limitation at this point.
From what I understand, it is, and the information I've gathered suggests that it is, and all three of these issues that I've just mentioned are addressed in the Stop the Grinch Act, which includes temporary solutions to a lot of those same problems. Now, Mr. Butler, there has been a lot of conversation about rerouting cargo to less congested ports. Is that happening? And to the extent it's not, what are some of the challenges that is causing that to not happen?
It has happened, and it's happened over the 18 months we have seen this surge. Often, though, what happens if you move too much cargo, you just create a problem in another place. I mean, there's a reason the cargo goes where it goes today. That's where the infrastructure is. That's where the customers are. So that's something that's been done on the margins by a lot of our members to try to maintain schedule reliability and keep things moving, but it's not something you can do on a wholesale basis.
Could temporary Jones Act flexibility help with the rerouting of cargo, or at least with the transfer of cargo off of a ship anchored off the coast of another vessel?
Senator, we have both Jones Act and non-Jones Act members, and we have a policy within our organization of not taking positions on the Jones Act.
No, I understand. I understand, and you and I may disagree on the Jones Act itself. I'm just saying that in a time of diminished capacity and diminished supply, sometimes it can be helpful to utilize provisions already built into the law that allow for that.
Senator, if I may.
Port depth is also an issue. Port depth also sometimes frustrates our ability to reroute because we don't have access to dredging. I'm out of time, but if you wanted to weigh in, I'd be happy to hear from you as well.
Sure. When you talk about waiving the Jones Act, and I know what you're essentially talking about is short sea shipping, which we have done a very thoughtful proposal to create a national maritime highway. What your proposal does in this bill does not address the underlying problem, the underlying hurdle that we have towards creating a national maritime highway, which is the double taxation issue. Waiving the Jones Act would do nothing to promote greater shipping opportunities, or actually to make it better to be able to move ship across up and down coasts and between U.S. ports. There are reasonable and strong ways to do this. Unfortunately, just waiving the Jones Act is not the way to accomplish this goal.
Yeah, but I strongly beg to differ, especially given that rerouting can be more possible. You can reroute and not have to deal with the Jones Act as much if you have access to more ports capable of receiving vessels that have made the transoceanic voyage. But we have access to so few dredging ships, and our ports are less deep than they need to be. We have fewer international ports capable of receiving these vessels. And so that's a problem as well that needs to be addressed. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee.